Growing up, I used to hear my grandfather's stories about the fabric factory on the outskirts of town. He called it the Looming, a place where the machines had their own personalities, their own rhythms, and their own demands. He said it like a joke, but his eyes always lingered too long in the shadows when he talked about it. I never thought I'd end up there, but life has a funny way of pushing you where you least expect. It started last October when the hospital bills for my mom's surgery began piling up. I had to take the first job I could get, and the mill was hiring. My first day was drenched in the smell of oil and dust. The air hummed with the rhythmic pounding of the looms, a symphony of mechanical precision that was somehow both mesmerizing and suffocating. The foreman, Mr. Griggs, barely looked at me as he handed over my schedule and gestured toward my station. "Keep the threads from tangling," he grunted. "And whatever you do, don't stop the machine." At the time, I thought it was a strange thing to say. Why would I stop the machine? It wasn't until later that I realized his words were more of a warning than an instruction. My first shift was uneventful, just hours of watching fabric heat through the industrial looms. The other workers kept to themselves, their faces pale and drawn. No one spoke above the roar of the machines. When the shift ended, I walked out into the crisp night air, feeling like I'd escaped something nameless. But I told myself it was just nerves. New job jitters. The first week passed in a blur of monotony, but things began to change by the second. I started noticing small, unsettling details. The looms, massive and ancient, seemed to pulse with an almost organic rhythm. Sometimes, when I wasn't looking directly at them, I'd catch a flicker of movement from the corner of my eye, like the machinery was shifting on its own. The fabric they produced, yards and yards of shimmering, unearthly material, felt wrong under my fingers. Too soft, too alive. It wasn't just the machines. The other workers acted as strange. They avoided eye contact and moved like marionettes, their movements stiff and jerky. I once caught a glimpse of Maria, the woman who worked 2 stations down from me, muttering under her breath while staring blankly at the fabric feeding through her loom. Her lips moved soundlessly, her eyes wide with terror. When I called her name, she flinched and hurried away, mumbling an excuse. One night, during a late shift, I heard something that made my blood run cold. Beneath the clatter of the machines, there was a low, guttural sound, almost like a growl. I froze, straining to hear it over the din. It came again, longer this time, a deep, resonant vibration that seemed to echo in my chest. I looked around, but no one else seemed to notice. Or maybe they were just pretending not to. That night, as I left the factory, I asked Mr. Griggs about it. He just stared at me, his weathered face impassive. "You'll get used to it," he said and walked away. I didn't get used to it. In fact, the sounds grew worse. They started coming more frequently, accompanied by faint whispers that seemed to emanate from the fabric itself. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was insistent, almost pleading. Sometimes the whispers would crescendo into a sharp hiss that made the hair on my neck stand up. One night, I stayed late to finish my quota. The factory was eerily silent, the looms finally at rest. As I packed up my things, I heard a faint rustling behind me. I turned and saw a roll of fabric unfurling on its own, the shimmering material spilling onto the floor like a living thing. My breath caught as the edges of the fabric began to curl upward, forming shapes that looked disturbingly like hands. They reached toward me, grasping at the air. I bolted, not stopping until I was outside in the cool night. I told myself it was exhaustion, that I'd imagined the whole thing. But the next day, I noticed something on the floor where the fabric had been. A dark reddish stain that looked suspiciously like blood. I didn't ask Mr. Griggs about it. I didn't want to know. As the weeks went on, the factory's grip on me tightened. The dreams started. Vivid, nightmarish visions of being tangled in endless threads, the fabric wrapping around my limbs and pulling me into the machines. I'd wake up gasping, the phantom sensation of threads cutting into my skin lingering long after. One particularly bad night, I decided I'd had enough. I'd tell Mr. Griggs I was going. But when I arrived at the factory, something stopped me. It was Marie. She was standing at her station, staring blankly at the loom as it worked. Her hands moved mechanically, guiding the fabric through the rollers. I called her name, but she didn't respond. When I touched her shoulder, she turned to me with empty eyes, her face pale and gaunt. "We're part of it now," she whispered. Her voice was flat, devoid of emotion. The looming doesn't let go. Before I could respond, Mr. Griggs appeared behind me. He placed a heavy hand on my shoulder and steered me away. "Go back to your station," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. That night I made a decision. I'd leave the factory for good. I didn't care about the money or the bills. I just wanted out. I stayed behind after my shift, waiting until the factory was empty. Then I made my way to the foreman's office. I'd leave my resignation on his desk and never look back. The office was cluttered, papers and tools strewn across every surface. As I searched for a pen, my eyes fell on a folder labeled Incidents. Curiosity got the better of me, and I opened it. Inside were reports detailing accidents, workers disappearing, injuries that couldn't be explained, sightings of anomalous behavior from the machines. One report described a worker who'd been pulled into the loom, his body found days later, mangled beyond recognition. I barely had time to process what I'd read before the lights flickered and went out. The factory plunged into darkness, the only sound the faint hum of the looms. My heart pounded as I fumbled for my flashlight. When I turned it on, the beam illuminated a sight that made me stagger back in horror. The fabric was moving. Rolls of it slid across the floor, like snakes, converging in the center of the room. They began to twist and weave together, forming a towering figure that loomed over me. Its body was a patchwork of different fabrics, its eyes empty voids that seemed to pull the light from the room. It reached out with a hand made of threads, its voice a chorus of whispers. "Join us," it hissed. I ran. I don't remember how I made it out of the factory, but when I finally burst into the night, I collapsed on the ground, gasping for air. I never went back, never even returned to collect my final paycheck. The factory still stands on the edge of town, its windows glowing faintly at night. Sometimes I hear the whispers of my dreams calling me back. But I'll never go. I'd rather face the unknown than the horrors of the looming.